From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. So much to talk about today. We're going to look later on in the program about legislation on the nation's Capitol Hill regarding protecting older international adoptees who are really in danger of deportation under a slight glitch in a law that was passed about 20 years ago. Also, we're going to take a look at the battle on COVID and some of the new variants. We'll get the latest with our Lisa Riley-Roche from the Deseret News. But boy, this is a hot topic politically throughout the nation, has been since 1973 and even before. Roe versus Wade, the state of Mississippi has passed a law that could threaten Roe versus Wade at its very roots and core. And the Supreme Court at this point, while hearing this case, seems to be leaning toward Mississippi. We won't know that, of course, until late spring of 2022 or even summer. Now, we're not here to discuss the yays or nay, is this a good thing or a bad thing, but the mechanics of what is happening, especially when it comes to the law itself, the constitutionality, and now this challenge. And we're very pleased from the S.J. Quinney Law School at the University of Utah, Professor Tennille Brown is joining us. Professor, first of all, thank you for your time, and maybe you could give us an overview of what is happening in Mississippi. And it's always a mistake to try to read the tea leaves of the United States Supreme Court, but are you seeing anything that gives any direction to where things might be going?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here, Doug. So what's happening and what is being argued before the Supreme Court, or was yesterday, is this Gestational Age Act, which was passed by Mississippi's legislature in 2018. And this law never went into effect because as soon as it was passed, there was an injunction that was ordered in a federal court saying that it likely violated the federal constitution. But then what's happened since then is Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately died, and we had Amy Coney Barrett, who replaced her, who was nominated and appointed to the Supreme Court. So people in Mississippi thought this might be a good opportunity to try to press this law all the way to the Supreme Court now that there's been a change in the composition of the court. And so a really narrow question was before the Supreme Court, and that was whether all pre-viability abortions could be prohibited. But then in the oral arguments that we heard yesterday, the discussion went far beyond that. And as you suggested, got to the core of whether Roe v. Wade and cases after Roe v. Wade should be upheld.
Not just the justice that you just mentioned, but also Justice Kavanaugh and even the Justice Roberts. We seem to be hearing at least a sympathy for the argument, where they might ultimately go. Is that a correct interpretation when even the Chief Justice himself seems to be sympathetic at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a correct read. There seems to be some concern about overruling precedent. So every justice, and Justice Coney Barrett acknowledged that we really want to be careful before we overturn cases that have been on the books for several decades. But they seem to be teeing up some fairly softball kinds of questions for the Solicitor General of Mississippi, kind of getting him to try to acknowledge what some of the potential weaknesses might be so that they could then shut them down. It definitely seemed as if the kind of center of the court and obviously the right of the court were trying to think of ways to maybe not strike down Roe, but to maybe allow certain questions that come up in these cases to go back to the legislature. So that was a big departure. I think that was surprising for a lot of people when we heard the oral arguments yesterday and some of the briefs that were submitted, some of the amicus briefs. The argument really shifted away from viability and whether or not we should stick with this viability standard, which we can talk about if you're interested and what that means. But really the much bigger question of whether this is a right at all and whether this is a constitutional right that should be protected by the U.S. Constitution, or whether it should be something that we kick back to the states.
Many times when we are in the Supreme Court, precedence is of course looked at, called upon, and sometimes even used as a justification. But in one of the comments, I'm trying to recall which justice it was, they said that very recently the Supreme Court has turned over quite a few things that had quite a legacy of precedents.
Yeah, so there actually haven't been that many really dramatic overturning of Supreme Court cases. Obviously, there's Plessy being overruled by Brown versus Board of Education. There was a case called Bowers v. Hardrick that was overturned by Lawrence. But there really haven't been that many cases where the Supreme Court has reversed itself and said, we got it wrong before. There have been many cases under the undue burden standard that came up in Casey, which was a 1990s case that came after Roe v. Wade. There have been a lot of cases that have chipped away at how we think about that right to terminate a pregnancy. But there haven't been very many Supreme Court cases that have directly overturned existing precedent. There have been cases where things were kind of developed from the structure of the Constitution that didn't exist before. And I think maybe you're referring to the comments by Justice Sotomayor speaking about all of these things that the Supreme Court does and that we recognize as valid that are not actually in the text of the Constitution. There are a number of those kinds of cases, but there actually haven't been that many where the court has taken a sharp U-turn and overturned itself.
We have just a minute left, but how does this affect us in Utah? Because if I'm remembering everything correctly, it's 15 weeks that Mississippi is talking about. In recent legislation passed by the Utah State Legislature, it was 18 weeks. And I'm giving you a very short time on this. I apologize. But what effect might this have on Utah?
So it depends on how the Supreme Court rules. If what they do is get rid of the viability standard and allow states to decide when abortion can be banned pre-viability, then I think what's very likely to happen is that states like Utah, their legislatures will pass laws that go even further and restrict abortion even earlier in pregnancy. And if there is no constitutional liberty interest pre-viability, then it's very likely that these will be upheld if the court does what we think it might do and abolish the viability standard.
Professor, we thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights here on Sunday Edition today. And coming up next, we're going to take a look at the situation, especially here in the state of Utah, regarding COVID. Our friend and colleague from the Deseret News will be joining us, Lisa Riley-Roche. Boy, there's so much going on when it comes to COVID, when not only the traditional problems we've had now for almost 2 years, but the new variants and the very new variant that I'm getting word now from Lisa Riley-Roche, who will join us from the Deseret News. We're seeing the first case in the state of Utah. Is that correct, Lisa?
It is, Doug. It was only a matter of time, experts said, and sure enough, it turned up late Friday afternoon down in southwestern Utah. The public health department down there covers 5 counties, including Washington, where St. George is. This was an older adult who had recently returned from South Africa, and he's apparently recovering at home, showing only mild symptoms. The people around him are being quarantined, but it just reminds us how fast these things can travel. This man was fully vaccinated. He has received monoclonal antibody treatments. Everyone said in the health world that it was only a matter of time, and this proves true. I was trying to track throughout the day where exactly the variant had shown up in the U.S. and just ran out of paper to write down all the states. So now Utah is among them.
It's interesting to me as I listen to the national reports, the reports in general, and you use the term mild. That has been associated with most of the cases that I've heard of and the outbreaks that have occurred now in quite a few of our states. Is that expected to continue, that this will be a mild, or is it only mild if you've already been vaccinated?
Well, that's the question that health experts want answered. I've heard over and over again, a lot is not known yet about this new variant, the Omicron variant. The cases that have been reported have largely been mild, but experts say it's a small window into the people who are already infected, and it may not hold true. One of the most important things they say people can do is to get a booster shot. Well, first of all, be fully vaccinated, which everyone should be who's eligible at this point, 5 and older. because of the Delta variant surge that Utah is still going through, even before this new variant showed up last week in South Africa. But then getting a booster shot allows you to increase your antibodies and is probably your best defense at this point. But again, more needs to be known.
How is Utah doing? I see the numbers. What is it overall? All of the population in the state, 52% of us have been vaccinated. And I think among adults, older, in the category, it's 60%. How does that compare nationally? And how do our numbers of those actually afflicted with COVID, how is it comparing?
Well, Utah is lagging behind the national average in terms of vaccination rates. It's, I believe, a little over 55% for all Utahns. And remember, everyone 5 and older is now eligible for the shots. But with our young population, we're kind of catching up to that demographic lag that we had because so many kids weren't eligible. Well, now they are. So just over half. Some states have a much higher percentage. We are seeing a lot of cases here, unlike some places that saw big spikes with Delta the end of summer, early fall. Utah has seen pretty much a sustained high transmission rate, and that's worrisome to a lot of health experts who say that we need to be doing more in terms of vaccinations, in terms of getting booster shots, testing, and then staying apart from others, and then doing simple things like wearing a mask when you're out in public around others, or social distancing, washing hands.
Yeah. Lisa, we really appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise. We appreciate your reports that we read regularly, of course, in the Deseret News. Thank you for joining us on the program. Have a great holiday, and I look forward to actually seeing you very soon, perhaps even in person. We'll take a brief break, and we will be right back with more of Sunday Edition. Imagine you're over the age of 38. You are an international adoptee. You came to this country. You've been raised as an American. You fully function as an American citizen. But all of a sudden, an event, getting a passport, whatever it might be, you find out that you're not properly in the country and maybe even in danger of deportation. We had a conversation earlier this week with Sarah Jones, who is an activist, and she herself is an international adoptee. We wanted to share the conversation we had with Sarah. As I was reading through some of the information on the Adoptee Citizenship Act of 2021, I had no idea that an oversight, basically, the unintentional mistake that was in the legislation now 21 years ago, might be affecting 20,000 people. Sarah, tell us what this act is and what the mistake was 20 some odd years ago and how that's affecting folks.
Thank you, Doug. So the Adoptee Citizenship Act is trying to cure maybe a technicality that occurred about 20 years ago with regard to international adoptees who were brought over from many different countries to be adopted to U.S. citizen parents. And I actually happened to be one of those people. In 1976, I was adopted to Utah. And so I identify as a lifelong Utahn, but I was born in South Korea. And what happened is that Congress actually had the positive intent to give automatic citizenship to children who were adopted. But they put in a date that said, if you're an adult by this date, it doesn't apply to you, which if you look at that date span, covers about 200,000 children who were already in this country by then. And so most of us actually have been naturalized through the naturalization process. But if you didn't have a parent that did that for you or an adult that did that for you, you fell into this technical oversight and, unfortunately ended up without technical U.S. citizenship.
When you think that could affect upwards of 20,000 people, that's the estimate in our country. That is not insignificant. Do we have any idea what the numbers are here in Utah?
Well, if I've looked at the numbers, and I'm not, unfortunately, an adoption expert per se, but about 1 in 10 adoptions is an international adoption in Utah. And of course, international adoption, as we know, has really slowed down over the past years, which is, I personally think is great. But Utah has always been a family-centered and child-centered state, and has always encouraged adoption and seen it as a viable way for parents to form their families. And so children are brought over from many countries. At the time, it was 27 different countries that were adopting. And so, it's been part of our history. Hundreds of adoptees have been internationally adopted into our own state. And, unfortunately, there was even an adoptee who was deported because she ended up without citizenship and had no idea.
There's a term, and it caught my attention as I was looking through some of the information on this act, and it's discovery event. A lot of these individuals find out that they are basically out in the cold because they get a passport or they're applying for Social Security or something like that. I can't imagine what that would feel like, what kind of a shock that would be to be doing something that every U.S. citizen at some time does. And then you find out you're not really a citizen.
Absolutely. And from the adoptee perspective, keep in mind, this is covering people who are 38 years and older now into their 70s. And so imagine living basically your entire life in the United States, believing that you are a U.S. citizen. And I'm an adoptee. And so I think most parents try their hardest. And I think we all believe this fundamental principle that when you adopt a child, they're no different than a biological child. The rights are the same. The way you treat them, it's the same, right? So you grow up your entire life hearing this, believing this, and then it turns out there's this law that actually gives you a different citizenship status. So I have not experienced that myself, and I cannot imagine, having been adopted myself, now being faced with this, even the fact that I am now an immigrant and now need to prove that I belong in America, or in extreme cases, being sent to a country where I don't speak the language, I have no contacts, I don't know anyone, and who sent me to the United States in the first place. And so if you just kind of play that out, if any of us would be okay having that happen to one of our biological children, I don't think we would be okay with that. And yet somehow allowed that to happen to over 50 people who were brought here as children to form families.
Boy, back to the scenario you just mentioned. Can you imagine the hue and outcry that you would hear from one end of this country to the next if all of a sudden, just our kids went to some kind of, or participated in some kind of event, and they found out that they really have a different status and that they are not fully in the country legally? I don't even know the proper term. You mentioned Utah and our reputation, which I think is very justified, that we are family friendly, that we truly care about kids and family and the well-being of the entire family body itself. I think of how we came up with the Utah Compact regarding general immigration that was so compassionate, used as a model around the country. How are Utahns responding to this story when they hear it? And perhaps, maybe even more importantly, how are our representatives in Washington responding to this?
Well, I'm happy to say that so far, every single person that I have spoke with, including our congressional leaders, are always surprised when they find out this law is still on the books. And so typically it is with surprise, which is ironic, right? Because can you imagine being an adoptee finding out that you're not a citizen?
Yeah.
So, right, everybody assumes that, of course, you would be a U.S. citizen. And so most people have been, I haven't had anyone yet that has seriously disagreed with me that the current law is correct as it stands. I think all of us acknowledge that there's just something that feels wrong about having something that puts our international adoptees who we want to feel welcome and loved and who truly believe they are American, that wants to put them in the right place. So I've been really happy that congressional leaders, state leaders, Doug, I will mention that Senator Janie Iwamoto is going to be asking for a resolution in this next legislative season to ask for Utah to support this change. Our congressional leaders have been really supportive. Now, John Curtis, Representative John Curtis has actually he is the co-lead on the House side for this bill. And so I think that speaks, volumes around Utah leading the way where we do that so well in so many areas. Representative Burgess Owens is also a co-sponsor as well. And so we're really hoping that Senator Lee, Senator Romney, Representative Moore, and Representative Stewart, that they follow suit and really get behind this act.
Right where I'm standing now, we're broadcasting from my home in Holiday. Senator Iwamoto is my senator, and then also John Curtis is my congressman. I'm very glad to hear that they are on board. For those of us who perhaps aren't sure what our congressperson is doing or what our senators are doing locally and in Washington, D.C., what can they do? Just good old contact, the old American way of calling your congressman?
Absolutely. I am not a career politician by any means, and I have to say that our representatives have been very responsive, and they need to see that more people care about this. Now, obviously, I care so much because I am adopted, but there has been this act is actually being supported by a coalition of not just adoptees, adoption attorneys, families who have adopted, parents, immigration specialists, right? There is a massive coalition nationwide that supports this. So you do not have to be an adoptee to reach out to speak to your congressperson. But if you care about, adoption as a way of forming families, and that children should feel like they belong to their families in every single way, then I really do hope that you'll reach out, send an email, phone call. There is a lot of activity going on.
Sarah, this has been very enlightening. I certainly appreciate you joining us on Sunday Edition. We'll keep a very close eye on this, and as it progresses along, we'll be chatting again.
Thank you so much, Doug. Appreciate your time.
About 2 years ago, I was doing the Sunday Edition program. Of course, it was in the studio, and I had a brand new grandson, and they happened to be touring the station at the time. And so I kind of slipped him onto the set, and we have a brand new addition to the Wright household. As a matter of fact, she kind of gave us a little bit of a scare by coming considerably early. But I wanted to introduce you all to my brand new granddaughter. This is Brecken, and as a matter of fact, she's been with us now for quite a while, but this is her actual day that she was supposed to arrive. So I just wanted to show her off a little bit, express gratitude for all of those who are watching Sunday Edition. Have a great weekend. Here's a spoken word. This coming up next.